Chapter 2. The Talmud Reviled. The Christian of today is bombarded from all sides with reference to our Judeo-Christian heritage, our Judeo-Christian civilization, and the brotherhood which should prevail, presumably, between Christian and Talmudic Judaism. Such propaganda could only succeed if one is in ignorance as to the nature of the Talmud and the total antagonism between present-day Judaism and Christianity, which necessarily must exist. Over the centuries, and right up to the present century, there was not such ignorance of the Talmudic precepts. The truth, as it was repeatedly revealed, caused it and its adherents to be reviled, and justly so. It is indeed strange that the bulls of the popes over the many centuries, warning against the Jews, should be seemingly unknown to the Catholic clergy today, and that the writings of Luther, which generally are like almost a second gospel to Protestants of the Lutheran fold, should be equally unknown on this subject today. The first English translation of the Babylonian Talmud was in 1903 by Rodkinson, real name M. Levi Frumkin, and was edited by Rabbi Isaac M. Wise, father of so-called Reformed Judaism. Rodkinson deleted much of the filth which is in the unexpurgated Talmud, and used no identifying folio numbers as were in the original, but nevertheless, even this abridged translation proved very revealing. The introduction states, quote, "The persecutors of the Talmud, during the period ranging from the 1st century BC, have varied in their character, objects, and actions. In one respect, however, they all agreed, namely, in their general wish to destroy its existence. Careful consideration of its many vicissitudes certainly justifies the assertion that the Talmud is one of the wonders of the world. During the 20 centuries of its existence, not one of them has passed without great and powerful enemies vying with each other, and other exhausting every effort to destroy it. Still, it survived in its entirety, and not only has the power of its foes failed to destroy even a single line, but it has not even been able materially to weaken its influence for any length of time. It still dominates the minds of a whole people, who venerate its contents as divine truth, and countless numbers have sacrificed their lives and their possessions to save it from perishing." End quote. Title: Emperor Hadrian and the Talmud. Hadrian was emperor of the Roman World Empire from 117 AD to his death 138 AD. In 132 AD, the Jews began a revolt, and for 4 years carried on a bloody war. Otherwise, Hadrian's reign was peaceful. The reason for this Pharisee revolt is told by Rodkinson in the History of the Talmud, quote, "One of the causes of the great revolt against the Romans at this time was the prohibition by the Roman government of the study of the Torah, the Talmud. They rebelled, led by Bar Kokhba. Rabbi Akiba was the first to become his adherent, who journeyed from town to town, inciting the Israelites to rebel. It is not surprising, therefore, that Hadrian was not contented barely with the massacre of the sages of the Talmud, but was intent also on the destruction of the Talmud itself. He decreed that if any of the old rabbis should qualify a young rabbi, both should be put to death, believing that with the death of the elder generation, the Talmud would be forgotten, and Israel would blend with the nations, and its memory be obliterated, because he very well knew that as long as the Talmud existed, there was little hope for the assimilation of the Jews with other nations. This decree, however, was not executed. The efforts of Hadrian met with no success. He saw the Talmud still existing, uniting Israel into one people, and establishing it still more firmly as a national and religious whole. The Talmud regained its former power and influence." End quote. And the pupil of one of the contemporary rabbis, Rabbi Jehuda the Nasi, also known as the Prince, became the compiler of the Mishnah, or laws of the Talmud. In 553 A.D., Emperor Justinian forbade the spread of the Talmudic books throughout the Roman Empire. Title: The Popes and the Talmud. Writing of the battles of the Talmud and its followers, authored by the Pharisees, we further read of events following the Sadducees, Samaritans, and followers of Jesus and the early Roman emperors. Quote, "The rabbis next encountered the popes. From the time of Pope Innocent III, the Talmud was burned at the stake in nearly every century, from the 11th to the 18th century in Italy, France, Germany, Spain, and many other countries." End quote. Rodkinson speaks of the disputations which the popes and kings held, in which the accusers of the Talmud were answered by its defenders. The results were always that when the criminality of the Talmud was revealed in all its horror, the Talmud was ordered burned, expunged, or censored. The same thing always started over again later. Rodkinson continues, "Still, what has been the result? The Talmud exists today, and not one letter in it is missing." End quote. Rodkinson then lists a partial chart of the burning of the Talmud at the hands of kings and popes. Jewish encyclopedias give credit, however, to various popes for stopping violence against Jews, for seeking to convert them, and securing certain rights for them in territories over which they exercised temporal power. Although the bishops were issuing restrictive laws against Jewish aggressions long before this, the reign of Gregory the Great, from 590 to 604, is taken as the starting point of consistent relations between the Jews and the popes. He condemned the holding of the Christian slaves by Jews. Pope Leo VII wrote the Archbishop of Mayence a reply telling him he might offer his Jews the choice between conversion or immigrating. Anacletus II, antipope, was a Jew, and his claim to the papacy always contested. Benedictus VIII had a number of Jews put to death for blasphemy against Jesus. Gregory VII charged the German Emperor Henry IV with favoritism towards the Jews, and, quote, in 1078, he renewed the canonical laws which prohibited giving Jews power over Christians. Jews might not be employed as tax farmers or mint masters, end quote. Pope Calixtus II, from 1119 to 1124, and Pope Alexander III are cited for pro-Jewish acts. Innocent III is the most hated of the popes in Jewish literature. In 1215, the Fourth Lateral Council, which he convened, quote, renewed the old canonical prohibitions against trusting the Jews with public offices and introduced the law demanding that Jews should wear a distinctive sign on their garments. Nevertheless, he protected them against the fury of the French Crusaders, end quote. Pope Innocent III, in a long decree, stated that Jews are, quote, not to be killed by anyone. They are to us dangerous as the insect in the apple, as the serpent in the breast. Since, therefore, they have already begun to gnaw like a rat, and to stink like the serpent, it is to our shame that the fire in our breast, which is being eaten by them, does not consume them. Although Christian piety tolerates the Jews and allows them to continue with us. Although the Moors will not tolerate them, they must not be allowed to remain ungrateful to us in such a way as to repay us with contumely for favors and contempt for our familiarity. They are admitted to our familiarity only through our mercy." End quote. Under this same pope, Canons 67 through 70 were adopted by the Fourth Lateran Council, which included protective measures against Jewish usury, their wearing of a distinguishing badge to warn Christians, forbidding intercourse with Christians as employees in marriage, and bearing their testimony as witnesses in legal matters, their license for perjury under the Kol Nidre then being well known. Gregory IX, in various official documents, insisted on the strict execution of the canonical laws against the Jews. His successor, Innocent IV, ordered the burning of the Talmud in Paris in 1244. Through Emperor Sigismund, who was heavily indebted to them, they, the Jews, obtained from Pope Martin V from 1470 to 31 various bulls. In the last years of his pontificate, however, he repealed several of his ordinances, charging that they had been obtained under false pretenses. Popes Eugene IV and Nicholas V are cited for moderation. Sixtus IV sanctioned the Spanish Inquisition, which was aimed at the Marranos, namely 300,000 Jews who had entered the church but retained their Talmudism, and secured power over all phases of life, of Spanish life in particular. One who reads the Jewish press today will see congratulations to Israel from Spanish Catholics who identify themselves as Talmudic Jews, descended from those who have practiced their Talmudism secretly ever since 1492, when their Marrano coreligionists were expelled from Spain. If nothing else, the term convert, as applied to Jews, must be viewed cautiously in view of the concealed Judaism of the Marranos, which continued for centuries. One must learn, also, from Jewish authorities that Torquemada himself, leading the Inquisition, was a Jew, and that the Inquisition was only aimed at the Marranos, who, under the pretense of conversion, had threatened to end Christianity by their inside machinations. The Jewish Encyclopedia continues, quote, Alexander VI, Borgia, known in history as the most profligate of the popes, was rather favorably inclined towards the Jews, end quote. Leo X, one of the Medicis who fanned the Reformation by sponsoring a great renaissance of paganism and filled the Platonic Academy and salons of Rome and Florence with Jews, expounding Talmud and occult Kabbalism, is called, quote, the humanist, favorably inclined towards the Jews, whom he employed not only as physicians, but also as artists and in other positions at his court. The beginning of the Reformation influenced his action in the controversy between Reuchlin and Pfefferkorn, which he settled in such a way as not to give any encouragement to those who demanded reforms in the church. End quote. The story of the sincerely converted Jew, Pfefferkorn, who aired the infamies of the Talmud, as opposed by the Catholic renegade, Reuchlin, dupe of the head of the Jewish community of Rome, and the pro-Jewish Medici Pope, ended with Pfefferkorn being silenced. Reuchlin not being tried for heresy, as he was scheduled to be, and indeed should have been, and with two hostile camps in nearly every German town taking sides for or against the Talmud. One may ask, quote, how could anyone reading the Talmud, says, see reproductions elsewhere herein, argue about its contents? End quote. This regard, however, it must be remembered that only with the relatively unexpurgated Sonsino translation of the Talmud in this century in the contemporary language, English, has it become possible for the non-Jew to receive the full impact of what the Talmud says. In other trials, arguments could rage as to what a Yiddish or Hebrew text of the Talmud really meant, if translated. Nevertheless, the Jews always ultimately lost such arguments, as witness the condemnation of the Talmud by non-Jews through the centuries. Even though the Sonsino English translation of the Talmud is not readily available, except in major libraries, to be read there and not taken out. Clement VII, another Medici servant of Jewry, was the bastard son of Giulio, brother of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who found a pagan salon, the Platonic Academy. The Platonic Academy attempted the old Talmudic strategy of harmonizing pagan philosophy with Christianity, as Maimonides had tried to do with biblical Judaism. Lorenzo had his son Giovanni, I believe that's how you say that, Giovanni, or Leo X, made a cardinal through his influence with Innocent VIII at 13, having also made an archbishop at 7. Ready to ascend the throne, Giovanni promptly made 5 of his relatives cardinals, including his bastard cousin, Giulio. Leo X, Giovanni, made pope on March 11, 1513, was ordained a priest on the 15th, and made a bishop on the 19th of the same month, and he reigned until December 1st, 1521, 9 years later. It was this pope, Leo X, who launched the selling of the indulgences in 1517, the immediate cause of Luther's break with the Church and of Europe's arousal. Every effort was made to corrupt and Talmudize the Church from the inside, while Jewry worked to wreck it from the outside. The hotheads among Jews, says Jewish historian Cecil Roth, expected to end Christianity and supplant it with Talmudism. But when Luther nailed his thesis on the Wittenberg Cathedral door, he nailed the Jews back into the ghetto, and popes eager for Christian faith and morals were elected in place of the pro-Talmudic humanist Medici popes. Luther, in turn, found the same forces polluting his own following, and ended his life beseeching the Protestant princes to expel or put at hard labor all Talmudists, after burning synagogues and Talmuds first of all. Read his words, if you can now find them other than here in any library. There is only praise for the Medici popes in Jewish literature, and only disappointment about the condition of Jewry during the Reformation and afterwards, for the succeeding popes drove the Talmudists out of the Vatican circles and back into the ghetto. Bewailing this, the Jewish Encyclopedia reports how the Talmud was burned by Pope Julius III in 1553, and Christians prohibited from printing it. Quote, the worst was yet to come. End quote. Paul IV, from 1555 to 1559, in his bull, quote, Comnimis Absurdum, end quote, not only renewed all the canonical restrictions on Jews, but restricted their commercial activities and made them wear a yellow hat and live in their own territory, the ghetto. Concerning this period, the Jews and the Medici, Jewish historian Cecil Roth states in his Jews of Italy, Jewish Publication Society of America, 1946, quote, Girolamo Savonarola was successful. In 1494, the great Dominican drove out the Medici. Thereafter, their position in the city Florence was a sort of barometer of its political state. When the Medici returned in 1512, they, the Jews, came too, and when the Medici were driven out in 1527, they accompanied them. It was only when the ruling house was at least securely established from 1530 onwards that the interruptions end and the continuous history of the Florentine Jewry begins. It continues, when Martin Luther nailed up his famous thesis on the cathedral door in Wittenberg, thereby setting the machinery of the Reformation in motion. The fate of the eager Jewries of Renaissance Italy were sealed. Threatened by this dangerous movement of secession, the Catholic Church began to set its house in order more systematically and more comprehensively than ever before, in the process known as the Counter-Reformation. No longer were the popes to be preeminently enlightened patrons of literature, science, and the arts, with worldly inclinations and interests. Henceforth, they were chosen among those in whose eyes the requirements of the church, spiritual and temporal, were paramount, who regarded the Jews as a leaven of disbelief which positively endangered Christianity and Christendom, at least until they were segregated from intercourse with other men, as the Lateran councils had prescribed 3.5 centuries before. Whereas the Talmud had been printed under Leo X, a Medici, in 1553, the Pope denounced the Talmud, and the other restrictions were set up. End quote. Pope Pius IV gave a brief period of respite from 1566 to 1572. Then his successor, Pius V, from 1566 to 72 as well, quote, not only repealed all the concessions of his predecessor, and not only renewed the laws of Paul IV, but added some new restrictions, end quote. In 1569, he expelled the Jews from his territory. Gregory XIII, from 1572 to 85, allowed the Jews to return, but introduced a large number of severe restrictions, and they were obliged to send every week at least 150 of their number to listen to a conversionist sermons. Sixtus V, from 1585 to 1590, quote, was more favorable to the Jews, end quote, and permitted the printing of the Talmud after it was censored in 1586. Clement VIII, from 1592 to 1604, ordered the Jews expelled and prohibited printing of the Talmud. Under Clement X, from 1670 to 1676, the Portugal Inquisition against Jewry was halted, but he refused to help the expelled Jews of Vienna. The worst feature under papal dominion was the closing of the gates of the Roman ghetto nights. Severe penalties awaited a Jew leaving the ghetto after dark, or a Christian entering it. Pius VI, from 1775 to 1800, quote, renewed all the restrictions enacted from the 13th century. The censorship of books was strictly enforced, and their attendance at conversionist sermons was enforced, end quote. And Leo XII, 1826, reinforced these rules with extreme rigor. Pius IX, from 1846 to 1878, started with a liberal attitude, but as stated in other Jewish literature, after he had been expelled from Rome at the hands of a Jewish movement which revealed its Talmudic anti-Christian face, he changed. To quote the Jewish Encyclopedia, Popes, Pius IX, during the first 2 years of his pontificate, was evidently inclined to adopt a liberal attitude. But after his return from exile, he condemned as abominable laws all measures which gave political freedom to them, showed his approval of the medieval laws as enacted by Innocent III. He maintained the ghetto in Rome until it was abolished by the Italian occupation of Rome. His successor, Leo XIII, was the first pope who exercised no territorial jurisdiction over the Jews. His influence, nevertheless, was prejudicial to them. He encouraged anti-Semitism, by bestowing distinctions on leading anti-Semitic politicians and authors as Luger and Germont. He refused to interfere in behalf of Captain Dreyfus or to issue a statement against the blood accusation. In an official document, he denounced Jews, Freemasons, and anarchists as the enemies of the church. End quote. The Indexed Expurgatorius, issued by Leo XIII in 1887, stated concerning, quote, the Talmud and other Jewish books, quote, although in the index issued by Pope Pius IV, the Jewish Talmud with all its glossaries, annotations, interpretations, and expositions were prohibited. But if published without the name Talmud and without its vile calumnies against the Christian religion, they could be tolerated. However, our holy Lord Pope Clement VIII, in his Constitution against impious writings and Jewish books, published in Rome in the year our Lord 1592, prescribed and condemned them. It was not his intention thereby to permit or tolerate them, even under the above conditions, for he expressly and specifically stated and willed that the impious Talmudic, Kabbalistic, and other nefarious books of the Jews be entirely condemned, and that they must remain always condemned and prohibited, and that his constitution about these books must be perpetually and inviolably observed. End quote. The 1905 Jewish Encyclopedia states, quote, Pius X, elected in 1903, is not sufficiently known to permit a judgment. But in his diocese of Mantua, before he became pope, he had prohibited the celebration of a solemn mass on the king's birthday because the city council, which asked for it, had attended a celebration in the synagogue. End quote. The Vatican's semi-official organ, L'Osservatore Romano, of August 13th, 1938, in an article headed The Jews and the Vatican Council of 1870, after speaking of the protective measures for the Jews by the Catholic Church, stated, but in order to set things straight, by this it was not intended that the Jews should be allowed to abuse the hospitality of Christian countries. Along with these protective ordinances, there existed restrictive and precautionary decrees with regard to them. The civil power was in accord with the church in this, since the Dolisus says they both had the same interest in preventing the nations from being invaded by the Jewish element and thereby losing control of society. But if Christians were forbidden to force Jews to embrace the Catholic religion, to disturb their synagogues, their Sabbaths, and their festivals, the Jews, on the other hand, were forbidden to hold public office, civil or military, and this prohibition extended even to the children of converted Jews. The precautionary decrees concern the professions, education, and business positions. End quote. Title: The Talmud and Martin Luther, the Father of Protestantism. When Pope Leo X started selling indulgences in 1517, this helped precipitate Luther's break with the Church and the nailing of his thesis on the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral. Almost immediately, Jews flocked to the new Protestant banner. Luther was sought after by 4 Jews. He, in turn, wrote a laudatory publication, Jesus Christ was born a Jew. Filled with sympathy for their long unbelief, which Luther laid to the unsympathetic attitude of the Catholic popes and hierarchy, and on his part welcoming the Jews to his heart. Present-day Catholic and Protestant sources are largely ignorant, however, of the fact that later, Luther found that Jews who had encouraged him to break with the Church were attempting to Judaize his followers. He then read the Talmud as introduced to him by a truly converted Jew. Afterwards he wrote, the Jews and their lies. With such denunciatory philippics that they make parallel utterances of the popes almost pale by comparison, that this only after he became aware of the truth. Luther wrote in The Jews and Their Lies, quote, "They exalt themselves and praise God for separating them from the heathen, in order that their raving, frantic, and foolish nonsense might be perfect. They praise and thank God first that they are human beings and not animals. Secondly, that they are Israelites and not Goyim. Thirdly, that they were created as men and not as women. Such foolishness they do not have from Israel, but from Goyim. For thus the historians write that the Greek Plato daily gave such praise and thanks to God, if such blasphemy and haughtiness could be called the praise of God. For that man, Plato, also praised his gods for these three things: that he was a man and not an animal, a man and not a woman, a Greek and not a non-Greek or a barbarian. Just as the Mals imagine that they alone are human beings, and all the rest of the world nothing but inhuman beings, ducks or mice." End quote. As to these matters, note the Jewish encyclopedia. Judah ben Eliah recommends the daily recital of the benediction, "Blessed be thou who hast not made me a goy." End quote. This also has, quote, "who hast not made me a woman," and also, "who has made me an Israelite, who has not made me a slave." End quote. This is a benediction prescribed by the Talmud. Luther also quoted John 8:39 in verse 44, wherein Christ told the Pharisees, "Ye are of your father, the devil," and warned Christians to be on their guard against these hardened, condemned people who accuse God of lying and proudly despise the whole world. They are boastful, proud fools. He goes on to call them liars and bloodhounds. Luther then cites the Book of Esther. Catholic and Protestant theologians in all centuries have protested Esther as being unhistorical, irreligious. The name of God does not once appear in it, and out of place in the Bible. Luther states, quote, "They are the real liars and bloodhounds who have perverted and falsified the entire scriptures from beginning to end without ceasing with their interpretations. Oh, how they love that book of Esther, which so nicely agrees with the revengeful people, they who imagine themselves to be the people of God, who desire to think they must murder and crush the heathen, as they at first demonstrated against us Christians, and would like to do so now, if only they could." End quote. Without any modern-day Jewish encyclopedias or Sonsino translations of the Babylonian Talmud, one sees that Luther nevertheless understood perfectly the way the Talmud blasphemes and hangs obscene charges on Christ through double talk and words. Luther recognized that any Messiah expected by Jewry was only supposed to lead them in slaughter to power, stating, "The Jews desired no more from their Messiah than that he should be a Kakba, leader of the Pharisee revolt against Roman 135 AD, in which, according to the historian Gibbon, about 1 million non-Jews were sadistically slaughtered, and a worldly king who would slay the Christians, divide the world among the Jews, and make them rich lords." End quote. Luther reflected upon the passage in 2 Peter 2 about those who speak great swelling words of vanity, promise liberty, but they themselves are the servants of corruption. For it had been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than after they had known it, to turn from the holy commandment delivered unto them, according to the true proverb, The dog is turned to his own vomit again, and the snow that was washed to his swallowing in the mire." End quote. Luther also wrote, "How much better it would be if they did not have God's commandment, or did not know it. For if they did not have it, they would be uncondemned. They are condemned because they have God's commandment, and do not keep it, but act against it without ceasing. In like manner, murderers and whores, thieves and scoundrels, and all evil men could boast they are God's holy and chosen people, because they have his word, and know that they should fear and obey him." End quote. By then Luther knew the Talmud, and he continued, quote, "The heathen philosophers write much more honorably. They write that man by nature is obligated to serve others, also to keep his word to his enemies. Yea, I maintain that in 3 fables of Aesop there is more wisdom to be found than in all the books of Talmudists and rabbis, and more than ever could come into the hearts of the Jews. Should someone think I am saying too much, I am not saying too much, but much too little. For I see in their writings how they curse us Goyim, and wish us all evil in their schools and prayers. They rob of us our money through usury. They play us all manner of mean tricks. What is worst of all, they teach that such should be done. No heathen has done such things, and none would do so except the devil himself and those whom he possesses, like he possesses the Jews." Luther continues, "Thus they call him Jesus, the child of a whore, and his mother, Mary, a whore, whom she had in adultery. Reluctantly, I must speak so coarsely, in opposing the devil. We do not call our wives whores, as they call Maria, the mother of Jesus. We do not call them bastards, as they call our Lord Jesus Christ. We do not curse him, but wish them all manner of bodily and spiritual good. Permit them to lodge with us. We don't steal and mutilate their children. Do not poison their water. Do not thirst after their blood. Now behold what a nice, thick, fat lie it is when they complain about being captives among us. Jerusalem was destroyed more than 1,400 years ago, and during that time we Christians have been tortured and persecuted by the Jews in all the world. For nearly 300 years, we might well complain that during that time they captured and killed the Christians, which is the clear truth. On top of that, we do not know to this day what devil brought them into our country. We did not fetch them from Jerusalem. On top of that, no one is holding them now. Land and highways are open to them. They are a heavy burden to us in our country, like a plague, pestilence, and nothing but misfortune. Should the devil not laugh and dance when in this manner he can have his paradise among us Christians, and to thank us, blasphemes and curse God and man? Now what are we going to do with these rejected, condemned Jewish people?" End quote. After Luther became conversant with the Talmud and the ritual cursings of so-called Judaism, his counsel exactly matched that of the ever-reinforced edicts of the beleaguered popes. A person who condones such blasphemies, he said, partakes of them. And he said that they should be forced to leave the country. Quote, "We should not suffer it after they are among us, and we knew about such lying, blaspheming, and cursing among them. Lest we become partakers of their lies, cursing and blaspheming, we are not permitted to take revenge. Revenge is around their necks 1,000 times greater than we could wish them. I will give you my true counsel. First, that we avoid their synagogues and schools and warn people against them, that God may see that we are Christians and not have knowingly tolerated such lying, cursing, and blaspheming of his Son and his Christians. For what we have so far tolerated in ignorance, I did not know. God will forgive us. Moses writes in Deuteronomy that where a city practiced idolatry, it should be entirely destroyed with fire and nothing left. If he were living today, he would be the first to put fire to the Jewish schools and houses. Secondly, that all of their books be taken away, prayer books, Talmuds, and not one page of it be left. For they use all that only to blaspheme the Son of God, that is God himself, and will never use it in any other way. End quote. Spiritually, Luther connects the Jews with those who betrayed Moses. Quote, of such are the remaining dregs of the Jews, of whom Moses knows nothing. They also know nothing of him, for they do not keep one passage in Moses. End quote. This reminds one of the constantly recurring charge of Christ that the Pharisees violated and nullified the laws of Moses, such as, quote, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Matthew 23:2. In other words, they occupy his throne, giving forth as Mosaic law their own foul permissions, which they attribute to oral laws Moses handed down to their group, unknown to the rest of the world. In 1543, Luther replied to the Talmudic charge that Jesus did his miracles by magic with the Tetragrammaton, or Shem Hampharash, the consonants of the word Jehovah, by which rabbis supposedly summoned demons. Quote, even with no further evidence than the Old Testament, I would maintain that the Jews as they are today are veritably a mixture of all the depraved and malevolent knaves of the whole world over, to afflict the different nations with their usury, to spy upon others, and to betray, to poison wells, to deceive, and to kidnap children, in short, to practice all kinds of dishonesty and injury. End quote. Digressing from Luther's The Jews and Their Lies, we see in Luther's Table Talk his view of the converted Jew, quote, if a Jew not converted at heart were to ask baptism at my hands, I would take him onto the bridge, tie a stone around his neck, and hurl him into the river. For these wretches are wont to make a jest of our religion. End quote. It is evident that Luther became familiar with the custom, wherever it did not endanger Jews, of spitting in the synagogue when reference to Christianity is sung in the Alanu, for he advised, whenever you see or think about a Jew, say to yourself as follows, behold, the mouth which I see there has every Saturday cursed, execrated, and spit upon my dear Lord Jesus Christ, who has redeemed me with his precious blood, and also prayed and cursed before God that I, my wife, and children, and all Christians should be stabbed and perish in the most miserable manner, and would like to do so himself, if he could, that he might come into possession of our goods. Should I eat, drink with, or speak to such a devilish mouth? I would partake of all the devils who live in that Jew, and would spit upon the precious blood of Christ. God keep me from doing that. End quote. Title: Luther's Last Sermon. Repeatedly, Luther warns the clergy against participation in the blasphemies of Judaism by aiding or enduring these in any way. His last sermon included this: you, my lords, and men of authority, should not tolerate, but expel them. They are our public enemies, and incessantly blaspheme our Lord Jesus Christ. They call our Blessed Virgin Mary a harlot, and her Son a bastard. If they could kill us all, they would gladly do so. In fact, many of them murder Christians, especially those professing to be surgeons and doctors. They know how to deal with medicaments, in the manner of the Italians, the Borgias, and the Medicis, who gave people poison which brought about their death in 1 hour or a month. As a good patriot, I wanted to give you this warning for the very last time to deter you from participating in alien sins. You must know I only desire the best for you all, rulers and subjects." End quote.
Meanwhile, the Jews were at it again, about to throw yet another revolt. Led by the proclaimed Messiah Bar Kokhba, he promised to retake Judea by any means necessary. He gathered his fanatical Jews, slaughtered the local Roman garrisons, and retook Jerusalem for themselves. When the local legions tried to restore peace, they were pushed back by 500,000 rebel Jews. Bar Kokhba purged Judea of all non-Jews, Romans and Christians alike, along with their wives and children. When news of the massacre reached the emperor, Hadrian went mad. He sailed for Judea, followed by 12 legions, and started killing every single Jew he found. No mercy was showed, no quarter given. Hadrian would settle with nothing less than the complete destruction of Judea.